Hello, and welcome to Lore and Sleep. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, if you're new around here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far this quiet little corner of the internet reaches. Now get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. Tonight, we travel somewhere quieter than most of the places this channel usually takes you. No armies tonight, no burning cities, no emperors weighing life and death in a crowded throne room. Tonight, we go instead to a stone cloister in the medieval countryside, to a world measured not in conquests, but in bells, where the same 8 prayers were said in the same order every single day for centuries, where a single life could be spent almost entirely within the same few hundred square meters of garden, church, and scriptorium, and where that narrowness, far from being a limitation, was understood by the people living inside it as a genuine, deliberate path toward peace. This is the story of the medieval monk, and more specifically, of a single ordinary day inside a medieval monastery, from the ringing of the bell in the total darkness before dawn to the final hushed prayer of the night, a day whose rhythm repeated itself with only small seasonal variation across the entire adult life of a man who had chosen, deliberately and often quite young, to set aside the ordinary noise of the wider world in exchange for a life organized entirely around silence, labor, and prayer. It is a story about a way of living that can feel, to modern ears, almost impossibly demanding in its discipline, and yet that produced, across the many centuries of its practice, some of the most serene, most carefully tended physical and spiritual spaces that the medieval world ever built. It is a story that belongs to the night, more literally than almost any other story this channel has told, since the medieval monk's day did not begin at sunrise but hours before it, in the coldest, darkest part of the night, when a single bell would call him from sleep to prayer. And it is that same quality of patient watchfulness in the dark that this episode hopes to bring to you now. Let it come to you slowly. The sound of a bell carrying gently across a sleeping stone courtyard, calling nobody anywhere in particular, only calling you gently, patiently, toward rest. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let the quiet of a stone cloister at night come to you out of the darkness, cool air moving gently between old arches, a single candle burning low in a window somewhere above. Let us begin. Christian monasticism, the practice of withdrawing from ordinary secular life to pursue a life of prayer, discipline, and religious devotion in dedicated communities, had its earliest roots not in medieval Europe at all, but in the deserts of Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean during the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, where individual hermits, most famously a figure remembered as Anthony the Great, withdrew into the wilderness seeking a more direct and less distracted relationship with God than they believed ordinary life within a city or town could offer, a movement of solitary ascetic withdrawal that gradually, over the following century, gave rise to organized communities of monks living together under shared rules and shared daily schedules, rather than each pursuing solitary hermitage alone. A transition from solitary to communal monasticism associated particularly with the 4th century Egyptian figure Pachomius, whose own communal rule is generally considered the direct ancestor of the wider communal monastic tradition that would eventually spread across the Christian Mediterranean and, in time, into Western Europe itself. Benedict of Nursia's own biographical details survive primarily through a single significant ancient source, a biographical account included within the larger collection of saints' lives that Pope Gregory the Great compiled toward the end of the 6th century, describing Benedict's own early life as a young Roman student who withdrew from his studies to pursue a solitary ascetic life in a cave near Subiaco before eventually gathering disciples and, in time, founding the monastery of Monte Cassino in southern Italy, the community for which he composed his own celebrated rule, and where he served as abbot until his own death, sometime around the middle of the 6th century, a monastery that, despite suffering several subsequent episodes of destruction and rebuilding across the many centuries since its founding, including a genuinely devastating Allied bombing during the Second World War that this episode notes without dwelling upon, given its own rather different historical focus, remains an active Benedictine monastery to the present day, a physical site of continuous, if periodically interrupted, monastic occupation, stretching back across nearly 15 centuries. Western European monasticism received its single most influential and most enduring organizing framework from Benedict of Nursia, an Italian monk who, in the early 6th century, composed a set of guidelines for communal monastic life that came to be known simply as the Rule of Saint Benedict, a text of moderate length and genuinely practical, carefully balanced wisdom that would go on to become, over the following centuries, the foundational governing document for the overwhelming majority of monasteries across the whole of medieval Western Europe, prized by later generations of monks and monastic historians alike for its distinctive combination of genuine spiritual rigor with a considerable and, by the standards of some more extreme contemporary ascetic movements, genuinely humane attention to the practical physical needs and individual limitations of the monks. Living under it, Benedict's own rule explicitly rejected the more extreme forms of physical asceticism that had characterized certain earlier desert monastic traditions, prescribing instead a genuinely balanced daily life, divided carefully between communal prayer, manual and intellectual labor, and adequate rest and nourishment, organized under the authority of an elected abbot whose own considerable personal power over the monastic community was itself carefully constrained by the rule's own explicit expectation that he govern with humility, consult his brothers on important matters, and remain, in the end, answerable to the same basic rule that governed every other member of his community, a genuinely thoughtful balance between communal governance and necessary hierarchical authority that later historians of medieval institutional life have frequently singled out as one of the rule's most durable and most widely influential practical achievements, a small piece of 6th century administrative wisdom that would go on to quietly shape the internal governance of countless communities for the whole of the following 15 centuries, the specific monastic community that this episode will follow across a single representative day, drawing on the considerable body of surviving medieval monastic customaries, chronicles, and archaeological evidence that modern historians have used to reconstruct medieval monastic daily life in genuinely rich, practical detail, should be understood as broadly representative of a Benedictine or Benedictine-derived monastery of the high medieval period, roughly the 11th through 13th centuries, a period during which Western monasticism, building on Benedict's own 6th century foundation, had developed into an enormously wealthy, enormously influential, and genuinely widespread institution, with monasteries scattered across virtually every region of Latin Christian Europe, ranging from small, modest rural houses of a dozen or fewer monks to enormous, politically and economically powerful abbeys, commanding vast agricultural estates and considerable regional political influence, each one, however grand or however humble, structuring its own particular corner of medieval Europe around the same essential rhythm of bells, prayer, and patient labor that the remainder of this episode will now follow through the course of one single ordinary day. Not every medieval monastic community organized itself along strictly communal or cenobitic lines, and considerable diversity persisted throughout the medieval period regarding the precise balance a given community struck between communal life and individual solitude, with orders including the Carthusians, founded in the late 11th century, maintaining a distinctive hybrid model in which individual monks lived largely in private, self-contained cells arranged around a shared cloister, gathering for communal prayer and meals only on Sundays and major feast days, while otherwise pursuing a considerably more solitary daily existence than the fully communal Benedictine model this episode primarily follows, a genuine reminder that medieval Western monasticism, whatever its shared Benedictine foundations, never developed into a single uniform practice, but rather a considerable family of related traditions, each striking its own particular balance between the competing values of communal support and individual contemplative solitude. By the height of the medieval period, monastic houses, following some variant of the Benedictine rule, along with the considerable number of later Reformed orders this episode's 8th chapter will examine in fuller detail, had spread across virtually the entire geographic extent of Latin Christian Europe. From the British Isles to Scandinavia to the Iberian Peninsula to the eastern frontiers of German-speaking Christendom, adapting their basic, shared rule to genuinely diverse local climates, agricultural conditions, and cultural circumstances while maintaining, across this considerable geographic range, a genuinely recognizable shared core of daily practice, communal governance, and spiritual purpose that allowed a traveling monk to arrive at an unfamiliar monastery in a distant, foreign-speaking region and nonetheless immediately recognize and participate in its daily rhythm of prayer and labor, the monastery's own relationship to the wider medieval society surrounding it was genuinely complex and multifaceted, since a medieval monastery functioned simultaneously as a center of religious devotion, a considerable agricultural and economic enterprise, managing extensive land holdings, and the labor of numerous dependent peasant tenants, a center of education and manuscript production in a period when literacy remained genuinely rare outside clerical circles, a hospital and refuge, providing charity and medical care to the surrounding population, and, in the case of the wealthiest and most prestigious houses, a genuine center of political influence whose abbots might counsel kings and whose considerable wealth might fund everything from military campaigns to the construction of some of the medieval period's most ambitious architectural achievements, a genuinely central institutional role within medieval society that stands in some contrast to the more purely contemplative, withdrawn image that the word monastery might suggest to modern popular imagination, and it is precisely this same dual character, at once withdrawn from the world and quietly indispensable to it, that the remainder of this episode will now spend its own patient hours exploring. Entry into monastic life, whether as a young child offered by his own family as what medieval sources called an oblate, a practice genuinely common in the earlier medieval centuries, though increasingly discouraged by later medieval reformers who preferred adult monks entering by their own genuine choice or as an adult convert seeking to leave secular life behind, typically began with a period of formal testing and instruction called the novitiate, during which the aspiring monk, known during this period as a novice, lived within the monastic community, learned its rule and its daily customs, and demonstrated, to the satisfaction of the community's senior monks and its abbot, a genuine and sustained vocation for the demanding life he was preparing to permanently commit himself to, a probationary period that the Rule of Saint Benedict itself specifies should last at least a full year, allowing the novice genuine, extended exposure to the full annual cycle of monastic life, its long fasts and its brief feasts, its short winter days and its long summer ones, before requiring his final, binding commitment, a full turning of the seasons offered deliberately so that no one entered permanently into this demanding life without having first genuinely tasted the whole of what it actually asked of a person across every part of the year rather than only its more immediately appealing moments. The formal vows that a monk professed at the conclusion of his novitiate, permanently binding him to the monastic community and its way of life, centered in the specifically Benedictine tradition on three core commitments: stability, meaning a lifelong commitment to remain within the same specific monastic community, rather than wandering between different houses, a vow that reflects Benedict's own considerable concern with the spiritual dangers of restless, unstable wandering that he had observed among certain less disciplined contemporary monastic movements. Conversion of life, a broader commitment to the ongoing, lifelong process of spiritual transformation and discipline that the monastic life as a whole was understood to cultivate, and obedience, a commitment to submit his own individual will to the authority of the abbot and the wider governance of the monastic community, understood within medieval monastic theology not as a demeaning submission, but as a genuine spiritual discipline specifically intended to break down the prideful self-will that Benedictine spirituality identified as one of the deepest obstacles to genuine humility and genuine union with God, alongside the fully professed choir monks who bore primary responsibility for the community's communal liturgical prayer life. Many medieval monasteries, particularly following the Cistercian reforms, this episode's 8th chapter will examine in fuller detail, also incorporated a distinct category of lay brothers, or conversely, men who had made their own genuine monastic commitment and lived within the wider monastic community, but who, typically lacking the Latin literacy required for full participation in the community's formal liturgical life, devoted their own labor primarily to the monastery's practical agricultural and craft work, a genuinely significant institutional innovation that allowed medieval monasteries to draw on a considerably wider pool of devout men, including those from backgrounds that had not afforded them the clerical education that full choir monk status traditionally required, while still maintaining the community's own core liturgical life as the specific responsibility of its formally ordained and educated choir monks. Medieval monastic spiritual writing frequently described the individual monk's own inner life using the vivid metaphor of spiritual combat, a sustained inner struggle against temptation, distraction, and the particular spiritual dangers that monastic writers, drawing on a considerable earlier tradition of Christian ascetic literature, including the influential writings of the 4th century desert father Evagrius Ponticus, cataloged into a systematic framework of specific vices or temptations, including not only more familiar categories like pride, envy, and gluttony, but also the specifically monastic temptation of acedia already briefly mentioned in this episode's 5th chapter, a kind of listless spiritual weariness or boredom that monastic writers considered a particularly serious occupational hazard of the contemplative life, and considerable surviving monastic devotional literature offers genuinely practical spiritual guidance for recognizing and resisting each of these cataloged temptations, treating the individual monk's own inner spiritual struggle with a psychological seriousness and specificity that modern historians of medieval spirituality have found genuinely sophisticated. The theological framework underlying this demanding way of life drew on a considerable body of Christian scriptural and patristic tradition, emphasizing humility, self-denial, and the deliberate cultivation of what medieval monastic writers frequently called contemptus mundi, a scornful, or at least deliberately detached, rejection of worldly ambition, wealth, and pleasure, understood as a necessary spiritual discipline, allowing the monk to redirect his full attention and full desire toward God, rather than toward the competing distractions and temptations of ordinary secular life, a theological framework that found its most systematic and most influential later medieval elaboration in the writings of figures including Bernard of Clairvaux, the enormously influential 12th century Cistercian abbot, whose own considerable body of spiritual writing, including extensive commentary on the biblical Song of Songs, interpreted as an allegory of the soul's mystical union with God, shaped subsequent medieval monastic spirituality with an influence extending well beyond his own, specifically Cistercian monastic reform movement, the distinctive physical appearance that medieval monks presented to the wider world, including the characteristic tonsure, a shaved circle at the crown of the head, leaving a ring of hair around it, and the simple, undyed woolen habit that varied somewhat in specific color and cut between different monastic orders, but that consistently emphasized modest simplicity over any form of individual distinction or ornamentation, served as genuinely deliberate outward symbols of the inward spiritual transformation and renunciation of worldly vanity that entry into monastic life was understood to represent, with the tonsure itself carrying particular symbolic weight within medieval Christian tradition as an echo of the crown of thorns and a visible, permanent mark setting the monk publicly and unmistakably apart from the wider secular population whose own hair and clothing choices remained subject to the ordinary vanities and fashions of secular medieval life. Monastic spiritual practice extended considerably beyond the formal communal prayer that structured the monastic day, already extensively discussed in this episode's own title and to be examined in still further detail in this episode's 4th chapter, encompassing also a considerable tradition of private contemplative prayer and meditation, often centered on careful, slow, repeated reading of scripture and devotional texts. Through a practice medieval monastic writers called lectio divina, divine reading, a deliberately unhurried, meditative approach to sacred text, quite different in both pace and purpose from the more purely informational reading that modern readers typically practice, intended not primarily to extract information but to allow the words themselves, read slowly and repeatedly, and allowed to settle deeply into the reader's own consciousness to become a genuine occasion for prayer and contemplative encounter with the divine. The considerable body of surviving medieval saints' lives and monastic biographical writing, a genre medieval scholars call hagiography, preserves numerous accounts of individual monks' own personal, spiritual experiences and struggles, including genuine and often quite candidly described difficulties with temptation, doubt, and the sheer physical and psychological demands of sustained monastic discipline, a body of surviving personal and communal testimony that, whatever its own genre conventions and its own tendency toward pious idealization, nonetheless provides modern historians with genuine insight into how medieval monks themselves understood and articulated the considerable spiritual demands and spiritual rewards of the specific way of life this episode's remaining chapters will continue to examine in considerably fuller practical detail. The physical layout of a medieval monastery followed, with considerable consistency, across the whole of medieval Western Europe, a basic architectural plan whose surviving example, the famous 9th century plan of St. Gall, preserved in a manuscript in Switzerland and representing an idealized, rather than a literally constructed monastic design, has provided modern architectural historians with an invaluable template for understanding the underlying logic that shaped medieval monastic construction more broadly, organized around a central cloister, a covered, colonnaded rectangular walkway surrounding an open garden courtyard from which the monastery's principal buildings, the church, the chapter house, the refectory, and the dormitory, all opened directly, allowing monks to move between the various activities, structuring their daily life without ever needing to step outside the monastery's own carefully bounded, deliberately enclosed physical world. The abbey church, invariably the largest and most architecturally ambitious structure within any monastic complex, served as the physical center of the community's communal prayer life, its interior typically divided between the monks' own choir, where the community gathered for the many hours of communal prayer that structured their day, and a nave that, in monasteries that also served a wider lay congregation, might be accessible to visiting worshippers from the surrounding community, and the considerable architectural and artistic investment that medieval monastic communities poured into their own churches, visible today in the surviving Romanesque and Gothic abbey churches scattered across the whole of Europe, reflects the genuine centrality that communal liturgical prayer held within the wider structure and purpose of monastic life. The chapter house, typically a substantial room adjoining the cloister near the church, took its name from the daily practice of reading a chapter of the Rule of Saint Benedict aloud to the assembled community, and it functioned as the monastery's principal venue for community governance and discipline, where the abbot presided over daily meetings addressing the practical business of the community, where monks might be called to account for violations of the rule in a manner that this episode's own earlier coverage of similarly structured disciplinary chapter meetings within the rather different context of the medieval Knights Templar has already examined, and where, in many monasteries, deceased abbots and other especially distinguished members of the community were eventually buried, making the chapter house a space carrying both administrative and genuinely commemorative significance within the wider life of the monastic community. The cloister garden itself, the open courtyard at the physical heart of the monastic complex, around which the covered walkway already described was arranged, carried genuine symbolic as well as practical significance within medieval monastic spiritual understanding, frequently interpreted by medieval monastic writers as an evocation of the biblical paradise Garden of Eden, a deliberately enclosed, carefully tended space of order and peace standing in symbolic contrast to the wild, untamed, and spiritually dangerous world lying beyond the monastery's own walls and the garden's own practical cultivation, typically including both ornamental plantings and, in many monasteries, a central well or fountain, providing water for both practical and symbolic purificatory purposes, made it a genuine focal point for the quiet individual, contemplation and unhurried, walking meditation that monks might practice during the periods of the day not otherwise occupied by communal prayer or assigned labor. The calefactory, or warming room, represented one of the only spaces within the wider monastic complex, aside from the kitchen itself, where a fire was permitted to burn during the cold winter months, since the Rule of Saint Benedict's own considerable emphasis on physical restraint generally discouraged the kind of comfortable heating that wealthier secular medieval households might have taken for granted, making the calefactory a genuinely valued gathering space during the coldest months of the year, where monks might briefly warm themselves. And in some monasteries, where certain permitted craft activities requiring warmth, including the specific work of preparing writing implements for the scriptorium, might be practically conducted during winter months, when the scriptorium itself, reliant on natural light through typically unglazed or only partially glazed windows, would otherwise have been uncomfortably and impractically cold for sustained work. The scriptorium, the dedicated space where monks engaged in the copying, illumination, and preservation of manuscripts, a subject this episode's 5th chapter will examine in considerably fuller detail, was typically located near the cloister where natural light, essential for the painstaking close work of manuscript copying, could be most effectively utilized, and larger, wealthier monasteries frequently maintained substantial libraries adjoining or incorporated within the same general complex, preserving and continuing to expand collections of religious, classical, and scholarly texts that made medieval monasteries, alongside the cathedral schools that would eventually give rise to Europe's first universities, among the single most significant centers of literacy, learning, and manuscript preservation anywhere in medieval Europe. The considerable engineering sophistication that well-resourced medieval monasteries frequently invested in their own water supply and sanitation systems deserves particular note, since surviving plants and archaeological evidence from monasteries, including the English Christ Church Priory at Canterbury, revealed genuinely elaborate systems of pipes and channels bringing fresh water into the monastic complex from external springs and carrying wastewater away through dedicated drainage channels, a level of practical hydraulic engineering considerably in advance of what was typically available in the wider secular towns surrounding many medieval monasteries, reflecting the genuine practical value that medieval monastic administrators placed on reliable sanitation for a community whose considerable size and whose consistent adherence to regular washing itself specified in various monastic customaries as both a practical health measure and a matter of basic personal dignity, required infrastructure considerably beyond what individual, secular households of the period typically possessed. The dormitory itself, where the community's monks slept, typically, as already noted, in a single large communal chamber, rather than individual rooms during the earlier medieval centuries, was arranged with individual simple beds set in careful rows, and monastic customaries frequently specified detailed, practical regulations governing even this most basic and private dimension of communal life, including expectations regarding modest sleeping attire and specific protocols for the transition from the dormitory to the church for the matins service, already discussed in this episode's 4th chapter, a transition that, given the genuine darkness of the hour and the absence of any artificial lighting beyond carried candles or lanterns, required monks to navigate familiar interior spaces largely by memory and touch, a small practical detail that further underscores just how thoroughly medieval monastic daily life was organized around a rhythm of prayer that took full priority over the ordinary human preference for uninterrupted nighttime sleep. The refectory, where the community took its communal meals under conditions of careful silence, that this episode's 6th chapter will examine in considerable further detail, and the dormitory, where monks slept, typically in a single large communal chamber rather than individual private cells, at least in the earlier medieval centuries, before later monastic reforms increasingly favored individual cells for at least the more senior members of a community, completed the essential core of buildings arranged around the cloister, while the wider monastic complex typically also included an infirmary for the care of sick and elderly monks, guest quarters for visiting travelers and pilgrims, whose hospitality the Rule of Saint Benedict specifically and insistently commands monastic communities to provide, workshops and agricultural buildings, supporting the monastery's own considerable, practical economic self-sufficiency, and in many cases, an extensive herb and vegetable garden, providing both practical sustenance and medicinal supplies for the community's own use. The medieval monastic day was structured with a consistency and a precision that modern readers accustomed to considerably more flexible daily schedules often find genuinely remarkable. Around 8 fixed times of communal prayer, known as the canonical hours or the divine office, beginning in the deepest darkness of the night with matins, sometimes also called vigils, typically observed sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, when a bell would rouse the sleeping community from their dormitory to gather in the darkened church for an extended service of psalms, scriptural readings, and prayers that, particularly during the longer nights of winter, might last a full 2 hours or more before the community was permitted to return briefly to bed for a further short period of rest before the day's activities properly began. Lauds followed at dawn, a shorter service of prayer and psalmody specifically oriented toward greeting the rising sun with prayers of praise, a liturgical structure whose deliberate timing at the very moment of daybreak reflects the considerable symbolic and theological significance that medieval monastic spirituality attached to light itself, understood as a genuine and immediate symbol of Christ's own presence and of the hoped-for illumination of the individual monk's own soul, and the period immediately following lauds typically provided the community with its first genuine opportunity for private prayer, reading, or quiet reflection before the day's communal activities resumed in earnest. The considerable seasonal variation in the actual clock timing of these 8 canonical hours, already briefly noted in this chapter's discussion of prime, deserves fuller attention here, since the medieval system of dividing daylight into 12 equal hours regardless of the actual season meant that a summer daylight hour, when the sun rose early and set late, was considerably longer in absolute duration than a winter daylight hour when the sun rose late and set early, producing a monastic daily schedule that shifted considerably across the year, even as its basic 8-fold structure of canonical hours remained constant, with the period of communal labor between the morning and midday hours considerably longer during the long days of summer than during the short, dark days of winter, when the community's daylight working hours were correspondingly compressed and a correspondingly greater proportion of the day was spent in darkness, whether asleep, at prayer, or engaged in whatever limited indoor activity, including the calefactory-warmed craft work already discussed in this episode's 3rd chapter, remained practically possible during the winter months' more limited hours of natural light. This seasonal rhythm also shaped the monastic community's own sleep patterns in ways that differ considerably from typical modern sleep expectations, since the community's return to bed following matins and before lauds, already mentioned earlier in this chapter, meant that medieval monastic sleep was frequently divided into 2 distinct segments, separated by this substantial period of nighttime prayer, a pattern of segmented sleep that some modern historians of sleep have suggested may actually correspond more closely to certain natural human sleep tendencies than the single continuous nightly sleep period that modern industrial society has come to consider the normal default, an intriguing historical parallel to modern scientific interest in segmented or biphasic sleep patterns that this episode notes, without claiming any definitive modern scientific verdict on the comparative merits of either pattern. Prime, observed at the first hour of daylight, according to the medieval system of dividing daylight hours into 12 equal periods regardless of the actual seasonal variation in day length, a system this episode should note produced considerably different actual clock times for each canonical hour depending on the season, marked the community's formal transition from the night's prayer into the working day, typically followed by a chapter meeting in the chapter house, already discussed in this episode's 3rd chapter, where the day's practical business was addressed and where a portion of the Rule of Saint Benedict was read aloud to the assembled community, a daily practice of collective re-engagement with the community's own foundational governing text that helped ensure the rule's continued living influence over the community's daily conduct, rather than allowing it to become a merely formal, rarely consulted document. The considerable body of surviving medieval monastic sign language systems developed specifically to allow necessary practical communication during the extended periods of the day, including much of the working day, beyond the meals already discussed in this episode's 6th chapter, when the rule's own general expectation of restraint in speech encouraged monks to communicate essential practical information through gesture rather than through unnecessary conversation, represents a genuinely sophisticated body of practical medieval communication technology in its own right. with surviving monastic sign lists from various communities recording dozens or, in the case of the more elaborate systems, several hundred distinct standardized hand signs covering everything from specific foods and liturgical objects to particular categories of monastic personnel and specific practical needs. A system of silent communication considerably more extensive and more systematically developed than most modern readers encountering the general fact of monastic silence for the first time might initially assume terce, sext, and none, observed respectively at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours of the working day, corresponding roughly to mid-morning, midday, and mid-afternoon by modern clock reckoning, punctuated the day's main periods of manual and intellectual labor already introduced in this chapter, and to be examined in considerably fuller detail in this episode's own 5th chapter, with brief returns to the church for shorter periods of communal prayer, a rhythm of alternating labor and prayer that gave the monastic day its own distinctive, carefully balanced texture, ensuring that no single extended period of secular activity, however useful or necessary, was ever allowed to proceed for too long without being interrupted and reoriented by a return to the community's own central, defining purpose of communal prayer and praise. Vespers, observed at sunset, was frequently considered, alongside matins, among the most solemn and most spiritually significant of the day's 8 canonical hours, its own considerable liturgical elaboration and its position marking the formal close of the working day, reflecting a genuine sense of thanksgiving for the day's completed labor, and Compline, the final office of the day, observed shortly before the community retired to sleep, was typically the shortest and most intimate of the 8 hours, its considerable emphasis on themes of protection through the coming night and peaceful rest reflecting its own specific liturgical function as the community's final, quiet act of collective devotion before the Great Silence, a period of complete verbal silence observed by the entire community from the conclusion of Compline until the following morning's chapter meeting descended upon the sleeping monastery until the bell for matins would, in the deepest part of the following night, begin the entire carefully ordered cycle once again. The Benedictine principle, traditionally summarized in the Latin phrase ora et labora, pray and work, though this precise formulation postdates Benedict's own 6th century rule by several centuries, nonetheless accurately captures the genuine, carefully balanced integration of communal prayer and productive labor that structured the medieval monastic day, since the considerable hours not devoted to the canonical hours already examined in this episode's 4th chapter were filled, according to the rule's own explicit instruction, with a combination of manual labor, understood as a genuine spiritual discipline in its own right rather than merely a practical economic necessity, and, for those monks with the necessary literacy and aptitude, the intellectual labor of reading, study, and, in many monasteries, the painstaking work of manuscript copying and illumination that this chapter will examine. In considerably fuller detail, manual labor within a medieval monastery encompassed a genuinely wide range of practical activity, including agricultural work in the monastery's own gardens and fields, essential to the considerable self-sufficiency that well-organized monastic communities generally aimed to achieve. Craft work, including baking, brewing, and the production of various practical goods the community required for its own use or, in the case of surplus production, for sale to generate additional monastic income, and the physical maintenance of the monastery's own considerable buildings and grounds, labor that Benedict's own rule explicitly commends as a genuine spiritual discipline, specifically valuable for combating the particular spiritual danger that medieval monastic writers called acedia, a kind of spiritual listlessness or sloth that they identified as a genuine and serious temptation for monks whose days might otherwise consist entirely of prolonged contemplative stillness without the balancing discipline of productive physical activity. The scriptorium, already introduced in this episode's third chapter, represented the specifically intellectual and artistic dimension of monastic labor at its most developed and most historically significant, since it was substantially through the patient, painstaking labor of monastic scribes, working over the course of years and sometimes decades to hand copy individual manuscripts, that a considerable portion of the surviving textual heritage of the ancient and early medieval world, including classical Latin literature, patristic theological writing, and scripture itself, was preserved and transmitted across the many centuries of the medieval period, during which literacy and organized manuscript production remained heavily concentrated within monastic and, to a lesser extent, cathedral clerical institutions. Monastic scriptoria also played a genuinely significant role in the development and preservation of musical notation, since the considerable body of Gregorian chant that structured the community's own sung communal prayer throughout the canonical hours, already examined in this episode's fourth chapter, required, as monastic communities grew more numerous and more geographically dispersed, some reliable written system for preserving and transmitting melodies that had originally been passed down primarily through oral memorization and imitation, a practical need that drove the gradual medieval development of increasingly sophisticated systems of musical notation, from early neumes indicating only the general rise and fall of a melodic line without precise pitch information, through to the more fully developed staff notation associated particularly with the 11th century monk Guido of Arezzo, whose own practical innovations in musical notation and pedagogy exercised an influence on the subsequent development of Western musical notation, extending, in certain foundational respects, all the way down to the staff notation still used in written music today. The physical process of manuscript production involved several distinct stages and, in the more elaborate and well-resourced scriptoria, several distinct categories of specialized skilled labor, beginning with the preparation of parchment, animal skin specially treated and scraped to produce a smooth, durable writing surface, a laborious and genuinely skilled craft in its own right, followed by the careful ruling of guidelines onto the prepared parchment to ensure evenly spaced lines of text, the actual work of copying the text itself, performed by scribes working from an existing exemplar manuscript with painstaking care to avoid the kind of transcription errors that, accumulated across successive copies, could otherwise gradually corrupt a text's original wording over the course of many generations of hand copying, and, in manuscripts intended for particularly important or particularly wealthy patrons, the additional work of illumination, the painting of elaborate decorative initials, marginal decoration, and, in the most lavish examples, full-page devotional images, often employing genuinely expensive materials including gold leaf and rare imported pigments, including the deep blue derived from lapis lazuli that medieval illuminators particularly prized for depicting the robes of the Virgin, Mary, and other especially sacred figures. Among the many thousands of illuminated manuscripts that medieval monastic scriptoria produced across the whole of the medieval period, a small number have achieved particular and enduring fame for the sheer artistic ambition and technical accomplishment of their illumination. Most famously, the Book of Kells, an elaborately decorated gospel manuscript produced by insular monks working in the tradition of Irish and British monastic scriptoria sometime around the year 800, whose extraordinarily intricate interlaced decoration and vividly colored full-page illuminations represent, in the assessment of many modern art historians, among the single most accomplished surviving examples of early medieval manuscript art anywhere in Europe, a level of technical and artistic achievement produced through exactly the kind of painstaking, unhurried, scribal and artistic labor this chapter has already described, undertaken by monks whose own individual names have, in the overwhelming majority of cases, been lost entirely to history, despite the extraordinary and enduring value of the work their patient hands produced. The education of novices preparing for eventual full participation in the community's scriptorium, labor, and its wider liturgical life typically began with instruction in Latin literacy, since the entire structure of monastic liturgical prayer and the overwhelming majority of the manuscripts a monastery's library and scriptorium worked with were composed in Latin rather than in whatever local, vernacular language the novice himself had grown up speaking, a genuinely demanding course of linguistic instruction that made the medieval monastery, alongside the rather differently organized cathedral schools that existed in some larger medieval towns, one of the only institutions in medieval society capable of providing this kind of sustained formal education, a further dimension of monastic life's own considerable, wider social and cultural significance, extending well beyond the community's own internal spiritual life. In the field of medicine, the physicians Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Ceos, already discussed elsewhere in this channel's own coverage of ancient Alexandria, represent a rather different and earlier tradition of systematic medical knowledge, but it was substantially through exactly this kind of patient medieval monastic manuscript preservation and copying that considerable portions of ancient Greek and Roman medical, scientific, and philosophical writing survived at all into the later medieval and early modern periods, when European scholars, working in the newly emerging universities, this episode's 8th chapter will touch upon, began the considerable intellectual project of recovering and building upon this preserved ancient learning, meaning that the monastic scriptorium's own painstaking, centuries-long labor of manuscript preservation represents one of medieval monasticism's most genuinely significant and most enduringly consequential contributions to the whole of later European intellectual history. The considerable physical toll that sustained scribal labor exacted upon the monks who performed it is preserved in a genuinely charming and frequently cited tradition of marginal complaints that medieval scribes occasionally added to the very manuscripts they were copying, brief personal notes, distinct from the manuscript's own main text, recording the scribe's own physical discomfort, fatigue, or simple relief at finally completing a particularly lengthy or demanding copying project. Small, genuinely humanizing glimpses of individual medieval scribal experience that survive today as one of the more personally affecting categories of evidence available to modern historians studying the otherwise largely anonymous collectively organized labor of medieval monastic manuscript production. The Rule of Saint Benedict prescribed a genuinely modest, carefully regulated diet for the monastic community, typically consisting of 2 cooked dishes at the main meal, supplemented by bread and, except during the more restrictive periods of fasting that this chapter will discuss further, a modest daily allowance of wine, a dietary regime that, while genuinely simple and deliberately restrained, compared to the elaborate feasting that characterized wealthy secular medieval households, was nonetheless considered by the rule's own explicit reasoning sufficient to sustain the physical health and working capacity that the community's considerable daily labor, already examined in this episode's preceding chapter, genuinely required, reflecting Benedict's own characteristic concern with avoiding the kind of extreme physical asceticism that he judged more likely to produce genuine physical harm and spiritual pride than authentic spiritual benefit. The rule's explicit prohibition on the meat of 4-footed animals, with specific exceptions made for the genuinely sick and infirm, whose recovery might require more substantial nourishment, reflects a considerable body of broader medieval Christian ascetic tradition associating the deliberate restriction of meat consumption with spiritual discipline and the deliberate curbing of bodily appetite, though considerable regional and chronological variation existed in how strictly individual monastic communities actually observed this particular restriction across the many centuries of medieval monastic history, with later medieval monastic reform movements frequently arising, at least in part, from genuine concern that certain wealthy and increasingly comfortable monastic communities had grown considerably laxer in their dietary and other physical observances than Benedict's own original rule had intended. Meals within the refectory were taken in careful, deliberate silence, a practice reflecting the wider monastic emphasis on silence as a genuine spiritual discipline that this chapter's own title specifically highlights, with the community's attention during meals directed instead toward a designated reader who read aloud from scripture or other approved devotional and instructional texts throughout the meal, a practice specifically intended to ensure that even the necessary physical activity of eating remained oriented toward spiritual nourishment and communal edification rather than becoming an occasion for idle conversation or gossip, and monks requiring some specific item during the meal. That silence prevented them from simply requesting aloud developed, across medieval monastic history, elaborate systems of hand signals and gestures, allowing genuinely practical communication without breaking the meal's own carefully maintained verbal silence. The monastery's own kitchen garden, distinct from, though frequently adjoining the more specifically medicinal herb garden already discussed in this episode's 7th chapter, provided the considerable bulk of the vegetables that formed the core of the community's own permitted diet, with surviving monastic garden plans and agricultural records documenting cultivation of a genuinely wide range of vegetables, including cabbages, onions, leeks, and various legumes, crops chosen substantially for their practical hardiness and reliable yield within the specific climate of a given monastery's own particular location, and the careful, systematic approach to garden cultivation and crop rotation that monastic agricultural writing frequently documents in considerable practical detail represents a further, genuinely significant dimension of medieval monasticism's own broader contribution to the preservation and, in certain respects, the practical advancement of agricultural knowledge across a medieval period when systematic written agricultural literature remained considerably rarer outside specifically monastic and, in a few cases, aristocratic estate management contexts. Fasting, understood within medieval monastic spirituality as a genuine and valuable spiritual discipline, rather than merely an unpleasant physical deprivation to be endured, structured considerable portions of the monastic calendar beyond the community's ordinary daily dietary restraint, with the extended fasting period of Lent, the weeks of penitential preparation preceding the celebration of Easter, involving particularly significant reductions in both the quantity and the timing of permitted meals, typically restricting the community to a single main meal taken later in the day, rather than the community's more usual pattern of 2 meals, a considerable physical discipline that medieval monastic communities understood as a genuine spiritual participation in Christ's own suffering and a valuable occasion for deepened prayer and self-examination. The specific medieval monastic beer brewing tradition, already briefly mentioned, deserves fuller attention here, since monasteries across medieval Europe, and particularly across the beer-drinking regions of Germany, Belgium, and the British Isles, developed genuinely sophisticated brewing operations, producing beer both as a safer alternative to often contaminated local water supplies and as a genuine, permitted source of calories and nourishment even during the more restrictive fasting periods. This chapter has already discussed, since beer, unlike solid food, was frequently classified by medieval monastic authorities as a liquid rather than a food, properly speaking, allowing its continued consumption even during periods of otherwise fairly strict dietary fasting, a genuinely practical theological classification that considerably shaped medieval monastic brewing practice, and that several modern monastery-operated breweries, particularly the Trappist breweries of Belgium, producing beer according to traditions and, in several cases, actual physical brewing facilities tracing back many centuries, continue to draw upon even today monastic hospitality toward visiting guests, already noted in this episode's 3rd chapter as a specific requirement of the Rule of Saint Benedict, extended into the community's own dining practices as well, since visiting travelers, pilgrims, and other guests were frequently accommodated with meals somewhat more generous than the community's own ordinary daily fare, reflecting the rule's own explicit theological reasoning that guests should be received as though receiving Christ himself, a genuinely significant practical dimension of medieval monastic charity that made monasteries an essential part of the wider medieval infrastructure, supporting travel and pilgrimage across a period when organized commercial lodging of the kind later centuries would take for granted remained considerably less developed and considerably less reliably available, particularly along the more remote stretches of the many pilgrimage routes that crisscrossed medieval Christian Europe. The monastery's own considerable practical involvement in food production and preservation, extending well beyond the agricultural labor already discussed in this episode's 5th chapter to encompass activities including brewing, since monastic breweries producing beer both for the community's own consumption and, in many cases, for sale to the surrounding population, represent one of medieval monasticism's more historically significant and more enduringly influential practical legacies. with several modern commercial beer styles tracing their own brewing traditions directly back to specific medieval monastic breweries, and the production and careful aging of cheese, another practical monastic specialty, whose considerable medieval reputation for quality several modern cheese varieties produced by monasteries that have continued operating essentially the same production traditions across many subsequent centuries continue to draw directly upon even today. The monastic infirmary, already briefly introduced in this episode's third chapter, among the wider buildings comprising a typical monastic complex, provided dedicated care for sick, injured, and elderly members of the monastic community, staffed by monks with particular medical knowledge and experience, often drawing on a considerable body of medieval medical learning that monasteries themselves had been substantially responsible for preserving and transmitting from earlier classical medical sources, including the considerable surviving medical writing of the ancient physician Galen, whose own theoretical framework of bodily humors continued to shape medieval medical understanding and practice throughout the whole of the medieval period. Monastic herb gardens, cultivated specifically to supply the infirmary with medicinal plants, represented a genuinely significant and, in the surviving documentary and archaeological evidence available to modern historians, remarkably well-documented dimension of medieval monastic practical knowledge, with surviving monastic medical texts and garden plans recording detailed knowledge of specific plants' medicinal properties and appropriate preparation and application, a body of practical herbal and medical knowledge that made well-resourced medieval monasteries among the most medically sophisticated institutions available to the wider medieval population, since monastic infirmaries frequently extended their care in keeping with the Rule of Saint Benedict's own explicit emphasis on hospitality and charity toward the sick and the poor, well beyond the monastic community itself, to include sick or injured travelers, pilgrims, and in many cases, poor residents of the surrounding local community who lacked any other reliable access to organized medical care. When death finally came to a member of the monastic community, whether through illness, old age, or, in considerably rarer circumstances, sudden accident or violence, it was met with an elaborate and carefully prescribed set of communal rituals reflecting the genuine centrality that death and the hoped-for eternal life beyond it held within the wider theological framework of medieval monastic spirituality, beginning with the administration of the last rites by the community's priests, continuing through an extended vigil in which brother monks maintained continuous prayer beside the body of their deceased brother, and culminating in formal burial, typically within the monastery's own dedicated burial ground or for particularly distinguished members of the community, including deceased abbots, within the chapter house or church itself, as already noted in this episode's third chapter. The mid-14th century Black Death, the catastrophic bubonic plague pandemic that swept across Europe beginning in 1347, and that this channel's own separate coverage of the wider pandemic has examined in fuller detail elsewhere, struck medieval monastic communities with particular severity precisely because of the same close communal living arrangements, shared dormitories, and shared refectory dining that structured the monastic life this episode has described throughout, since a single infected member of a tightly enclosed monastic community could spread contagion to his brothers with a speed and thoroughness that the more dispersed living arrangements of the wider secular population did not typically allow, and surviving monastic chronicles and administrative records from across plague-affected regions of Europe document monastery after monastery losing a third, a half, or in the most severe documented cases, nearly the entire remaining population of monks within the space of just a few catastrophic months. Losses so severe that many affected monasteries required years or even decades of subsequent recovery and fresh recruitment before returning to anything approaching their pre-plague population and their pre-plague level of communal and economic activity. The infirmarian, the monk specifically charged with overseeing the care of the sick, within the monastic infirmary, already discussed earlier in this chapter, occupied a position of genuine practical and spiritual significance within the wider monastic community, since his own accumulated practical medical knowledge, however limited by modern medical standards, represented the community's primary and often only available resource for addressing illness and injury, and surviving monastic customaries frequently specify the infirmarian's own particular responsibilities in genuinely careful, practical detail, including specific dietary accommodations for the sick that relax the community's own ordinary dietary restrictions, already discussed in this episode's 6th chapter, and specific provisions for ensuring that dying brothers received appropriate spiritual as well as physical care during their final illness. The monastic community's considerable liturgical and devotional attention to death extended well beyond the immediate funeral rites themselves, encompassing an extensive tradition of ongoing prayer for the souls of deceased brothers, reflecting the medieval Christian theological understanding of purgatory as an intermediate state in which the souls of the faithful departed continued to require and to benefit from the ongoing prayers of the living community, a theological framework that gave considerable additional spiritual significance and urgency to the monastic community's own sustained tradition of prayer for its own deceased members, recorded and organized through documents. Medieval monasteries, called necrologies, formal calendars recording the specific dates of individual monks' deaths so that the wider community could observe appropriate commemorative prayers on each subsequent anniversary across the many years and, in the case of long-established monastic communities, many subsequent centuries following any individual monk's own death. The monastic necrology, already briefly introduced earlier in this chapter, functioned in practice as a genuinely significant instrument binding together not only the living members of a given monastic community, but successive generations of that same community, extending back, in the case of well-established houses, across many preceding centuries, since the daily reading of the necrology's entries for that particular calendar date, a practice observed in the chapter house meeting already discussed in this episode's 3rd chapter, meant that a monk entering a monastery in, for example, the 13th century would regularly hear the names of brothers who had died in the same community 2, 3, or even 4 centuries earlier, a genuinely striking practice of sustained institutional memory that gave individual monastic communities a lived sense of continuity across a span of time considerably longer than any single human lifetime could otherwise provide. The monastic community's own considerable experience with mortality, encountered not as a distant abstraction, but as a regular, carefully ritualized dimension of ordinary communal life, likely shaped the wider medieval monastic, spiritual tradition's own genuinely sustained and genuinely serious theological engagement with questions of death, judgment, and eternal life in ways that considerably influenced the wider medieval Christian devotional and theological tradition well beyond the monastery's own walls, since monastic writers, drawing on this same sustained, ritually structured communal encounter with mortality, produced a considerable body of devotional and theological writing on precisely these themes that circulated well beyond monastic circles to shape the wider medieval Christian understanding of death and its proper spiritual meaning. Western monasticism's own long medieval history was marked by recurring cycles of institutional growth, gradual relaxation of original observance, and periodic reform movements seeking to restore what reformers understood as a more authentic, more rigorous return to Benedict's own original vision, a pattern most significantly exemplified by the 10th century founding of the monastery of Cluny in Burgundy, whose own reformed observance and whose considerable subsequent institutional success in establishing an extensive network of dependent daughter houses across much of Western Europe made Cluniac monasticism, for a period of several centuries, one of the single most influential and most widely imitated monastic reform movements in the whole of medieval Christian history. Modern interest in medieval monastic spirituality and practice has, in recent decades, extended well beyond specifically Catholic or Orthodox religious circles, with a considerable and genuinely broad-based secular and interfaith interest in monastic retreat experiences, contemplative practices including Lectio Divina, already discussed in this episode's second chapter, and the wider rhythm of structured, prayerful daily life that this episode has described throughout, leading many modern monasteries to open their doors to short-term guest retreatants seeking, whether from explicitly religious motivation or from a more general contemporary interest in rest, mental clarity, and escape from the pace of modern secular life, exactly the kind of quiet, carefully structured daily rhythm that medieval monks pursued as a lifelong vocation, a genuinely notable modern echo of the monastery's own considerably older, already discussed tradition of hospitality toward travelers and guests, now extended to a considerably wider and more religiously diverse modern audience than medieval monastic hospitality could ever have originally anticipated serving. The considerable body of modern scholarly, historical research into medieval monastic daily life, drawing on the kind of surviving monastic customaries, chronicles, architectural remains, and archaeological evidence that this entire episode has drawn upon throughout its preceding chapters, continues to refine and occasionally revise modern historical understanding of precisely how medieval monastic communities actually lived on any given ordinary day, a genuinely active and ongoing field of medieval historical scholarship that reminds us, much as this channel's own earlier coverage of other historical mysteries and uncertainties has repeatedly emphasized, that even a way of life as thoroughly documented and as carefully regulated by surviving written rules as medieval monasticism still holds genuine scholarly questions and genuine ongoing historical discovery still to be made, since the gap between what a rule prescribes and what a specific community on a specific ordinary day actually did remains, for historians as much as for anyone else, looking closely at any institution's own official rules, a genuinely instructive space worth continuing to examine with care. The Cistercian reform movement, founded in the late 11th century and achieving its own most significant institutional and spiritual influence substantially through the leadership of the previously discussed Bernard of Clairvaux, represented a further, in certain respects even more rigorous, reforming response to what Cistercian founders judged to be the excessive wealth, elaborate liturgical ceremony, and relaxed physical discipline that had, in their own critical assessment, come to characterize Cluniac and other established Benedictine houses of the period, favoring instead a deliberately austere architectural style, a considerable emphasis on manual agricultural labor performed by the monks themselves, rather than delegated to dependent tenants, and monastic settlement in genuinely remote, undeveloped rural locations, specifically chosen for their isolation from the wider secular world, a reforming vision whose own considerable subsequent institutional success, ironically, eventually produced many of medieval Europe's wealthiest and most agriculturally sophisticated monastic estates, since the Cistercians' own genuine skill in agricultural management and land development frequently transformed the deliberately remote, undeveloped locations they had originally chosen into considerable centers of agricultural wealth and innovation. The later medieval and early modern history of Western monasticism encompassed further significant reform movements, including the eventual emergence of the mendicant orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans founded in the early 13th century, whose own distinctive spiritual vision, emphasizing active preaching and ministry within the wider secular world, rather than the more purely enclosed, contemplative model of traditional Benedictine monasticism, represented a genuinely significant institutional and spiritual departure from the specifically cloistered monastic tradition this episode has focused on throughout its preceding chapters, even as these newer mendicant orders continued to draw on and adapt considerable elements of the older Benedictine monastic tradition's own emphasis on communal discipline, poverty, and structured prayer. Francis of Assisi's own personal spiritual journey from a comfortable merchant family background toward a radical embrace of poverty and itinerant preaching among the ordinary populations of Italy's rapidly growing medieval towns exemplifies the genuinely significant shift in spiritual emphasis that the mendicant orders represented relative to the older, more thoroughly enclosed Benedictine tradition this episode has focused upon throughout, since Francis and his early companions deliberately rejected not only personal wealth, but also, in a departure from Benedict's own emphasis on stability already discussed in this episode's second chapter, the settled, permanent residence within a single fixed monastic community that had characterized traditional Western monasticism since Benedict's own 6th century founding, favoring instead a genuinely itinerant life of preaching and charitable service, carried out largely among the urban populations that the older, more rurally situated Benedictine monastic tradition had engaged with only indirectly. The institutional history of traditional Western monasticism suffered its own single most significant and most historically consequential disruption during the 16th century Protestant Reformation, when Protestant reformers' own considerable theological rejection of monastic vows, purgatory, and the wider theological framework underlying traditional Catholic monastic spirituality, combined with the very considerable practical wealth that monastic institutions had accumulated across many preceding centuries, led to the wholesale dissolution of monasteries, across large portions of Reformation-era Northern Europe, most dramatically in England, under Henry VIII's own 16th century dissolution of the monasteries, a systematic institutional destruction that closed hundreds of previously flourishing monastic communities within the space of just a few years, and that redirected their very considerable accumulated landholdings and wealth into royal and private secular hands, leaving behind, across the English countryside in particular, the numerous evocative ruined abbey remains that continue to attract considerable modern historical and tourist interest. Henry VIII's own dissolution of the monasteries, formally implemented through parliamentary legislation across the years 1536 to 1541, was preceded by royal commissioners conducting detailed surveys of monastic wealth and, in several cases, deliberately compiling reports emphasizing genuine or exaggerated accounts of monastic corruption and declining discipline specifically intended to help justify the dissolution to wider public and parliamentary opinion, and the resulting closure of some 800 English monasteries within this remarkably compressed 5-year period represented a genuinely staggering institutional transformation, displacing many thousands of monks and nuns, some of whom received modest royal pensions, while others were left with considerably less certain prospects, and redirecting monastic landholdings that had, in some cases, been continuously held by the same religious community for many centuries into new secular ownership, frequently benefiting royal favorites and wealthy gentry families who purchased or received former monastic estates at prices considerably below their genuine market value. The physical ruins that this wholesale institutional destruction left scattered across the English countryside, including famous surviving examples like Fountains Abbey and Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire, whose roofless but still substantially standing stone remains continue to attract considerable modern visitor interest, became, in the centuries following the dissolution, genuinely significant subjects of English Romantic era artistic and literary fascination, with painters and poets of the 18th and 19th centuries frequently depicting these ruined abbeys as evocative symbols of time's inevitable erosion of even the grandest human institutions, a somewhat different but genuinely related fascination with monastic ruins to the one that motivated the earlier scholarly antiquarian interest in Roman ruins, that this channel's own coverage of Pompeii's rediscovery has already examined in a rather different historical context. Despite this considerable historical disruption, traditional Benedictine and Benedictine-derived monastic life has continued in unbroken or, in some cases, restored practice down to the present day, particularly across Catholic regions of continental Europe, that the Reformation's own institutional disruption affected considerably. And so we leave the medieval monastery resting in the quiet dark between Compline and Matins. We walk the cloister in the deep hours before dawn, past the quiet garden that generations of monks understood as their own small echo of paradise, and we stood in the church as the community gathered, still half asleep, for the long service of psalms that opened every single day of a monk's entire adult life, a service he would go on hearing in one form or another for as many decades as his own life allowed him. We felt the day's own careful rhythm unfold, hour by bell-marked hour, labor and prayer and labor again, never one without the other for very long, a pattern repeated so many thousands of times across a single monk's own adult life that it must, in the end, have come to feel less like a schedule imposed from outside and more like the simple, familiar shape of his own days, the way any of us, in our own very different lives, eventually stop noticing the particular rhythm we ourselves have long since settled into. We sat in the scriptorium among scribes whose hands ached from years of careful copying, preserving, letter by patient letter, a considerable portion of everything the ancient and early medieval world had ever managed to write down. We ate in silence in the refectory, listening to a reader's steady voice rather than to each other's conversation, and we sat quietly beside brothers in their final illness and beside the graves of those the community had already buried and continued year after year to remember in prayer. We considered the many later reforms and re-reforms that this long tradition passed through, Cluny reaching for renewed splendor, the Cistercians reaching back for renewed austerity, the friars eventually stepping outside the cloister walls entirely to carry a related but genuinely different vision of religious life into the streets of Europe's growing medieval towns. And we stood at the very end among the roofless ruins that a king's own 16th century decision left scattered across the English countryside, and beside the still unbroken, still quietly continuing daily rhythm that has carried this same basic pattern of bells and prayer and labor across nearly 15 centuries into monasteries that remain, even now, genuinely and quietly active tonight, somewhere, while the rest of the world sleeps. These are human stories. The monks were human, choosing, most of them quite deliberately, a life of genuine discipline and genuine restraint, not because the wider world held no appeal for them, but because they believed, with a conviction this episode has tried to describe honestly, rather than either mocking or romanticizing it, that exactly this kind of disciplined, quiet, carefully repeated life held something worth the considerable cost of everything else they were choosing to set aside, a choice that asked everything of them and that, by their own sustained account across so many centuries, gave something genuinely valuable back in return. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video or subscribe to the channel or leave a small quiet comment below. It helps others find their way here, and every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently tonight, carrying just a little of that same old patient, bell-marked quiet along with them into their own rest. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and let the night continue and let the old world keep talking in its old slow voice, one quiet cloister and one distant bell after another, for as long as you care to keep listening. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The cloister is empty. The scriptorium's candles have been carefully snuffed out for the night. Each page left exactly where its scribe set it down until morning. The last bell has already rung, and the great silence has settled, complete and unbroken, over the sleeping monastery. Let your jaw unclench, slowly, gently, the way it unclenches at the end of any long day that has finally, at last, been allowed to end. Let your shoulders drop and let them stay dropped, loose and unguarded for as long as you need them to. Let your hands open slowly, the way hands open when the day's last labor has finally been set down and there is nothing left to do but rest, the quill returned to its stand. The tools of the garden hung back on their hooks, the last page of the day's copying left to dry quietly until morning. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady, in and out, like a single candle flame standing still in a windless stone room, patient and old, and entirely at peace with the long night ahead of it, a flame that will still be burning, however low, when the bell for matins finally comes to wake the sleeping community once again. Sleep well, and good night, wherever in this quiet world tonight's old story finds you resting, however far that quiet monastery may be from wherever you happen to be listening tonight.